Ooh, what caused the Civil War? Well, we'll try a really short version because, geez, that could be like weeks or so of class, but we'll just try to narrow them all down to the four things that you see in blue here. And I'm going to go kind of fast because you can always pause and rewind or look more closely at something that I have on here. I'll just sort of talk our way through this, starting with revolutionary ideas. So, see, both sides of this debate and conflict believed they were following the American Revolution. And I'll show you this with starting with the patriots of the American Revolution, and then we'll look at the rebels, the southern side of the Civil War. So this is all the patriots were trying to do. Just a reminder from earlier this year, looking at all these things, right? Well, the rebels were also trying to break away from the country that they had been a part of for a long time and try to start up their own country. They're also demanding rights, just as patriots have been demanding rights of that place that they thought that they were from. They're complaining about government representation. They're complaining that changes are being made without them getting represented properly. And they're upset about getting access to land farther in the West. So, a lot of real clear parallels here. Why the rebels would think that they had the right, just like the colonists believe they had the right to rebel. On the other side, we'll look at the Federalists of that Constitution period. Remember all those folks from that period of history, compared with the Federals, the northern side of the Civil War. So this is all the Federalists wanted, right? George Washington was along on their side. We need to stick together. Remember, that was replacing the Articles of Confederation. And they hoped slavery would die out over time. They were just going to sort of leave it alone if that's what it took to stay together. Well, during the Civil War period, again, trying to keep the states united. Now it's Abraham Lincoln's words and actions, but same idea. If we're going to be free Americans, we have to stick together to stay away from tyranny. And here's the difference, though. These Federals are still concerned about slavery, but they're afraid it's going to expand over time. That's a key difference between them, why they're not letting that issue go, while the Federalists did. So you can imagine these two bearded men here fighting against each other, the blue on the left, the gray on the right, as their uniforms usually were. And one's thinking, George Washington would be so proud of me for fighting like this. And the other guy's thinking exactly the same thing. So that's just an illustration of our revolutionary ideals. All right, moving on to compromises. A number of compromises, and I could dig into more of these, but really we're going to focus on how both sides just did not keep compromising. We looked at compromises earlier this year in the Constitution period, but it just doesn't work anymore. The first one is called the Missouri Compromise. It's when, as you see here, Missouri goes from being just a random territory to becoming a state, and at the same time, Maine becomes a state. And other states had come in without needing compromises. Well, remember how Congress works? In the House of Representatives, it's based on population, and the slave states get to count about half of their slave population, not giving them a vote, but by counting them as members of that state. But still, the northern states would have more representatives, as more immigrations coming in, especially to states like New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Chicago starting to build up too around this period. In the Senate, though, you've got exactly two per state. And before this compromise, there were 11 slave states where slavery was legal in their constitutions, and 11 states that were called free because labor, any worker was free to go from job to job. It's that free labor. So in the Senate, it didn't matter that there was more population in the North like it does in the House of Representatives. It's about keeping that balance. Well, this compromise failed. Of course, it could also be called the Maine Compromise, because Maine was brought in too, but that's my own bias, being from Maine myself. Anyway, so this tried to help stop that debate over slavery that had been going on. It keeps that balance, yay. And it even drew a latitude line, a horizontal line, that would keep slavery out of most of the Louisiana Purchase. There's that red line right there. So all that area up here, slavery would not be allowed. Only just this little bit down here is where slavery would be allowed. So Missouri was above that, but we won't do that anymore. So That would have been nice, but it failed. Well, why did it fail? Well, it just didn't solve the problem of slavery. It's just moving it farther down. In fact, it cornered those slave states, and like a cornered animal is a dangerous thing to have to go up against. Anything in a corner starts getting desperate. And notice that line goes right across this New Spain, or later to be called Mexico. It looks pretty tempting for expanding farther, and sure enough, Texas and some of these other places here are going to be involved in that Mexican War a few years after the Missouri Compromise. So, zooming ahead 30 years to 1850, you've got 15 states on each side, but now California is ready to become a state, likely a free state, and there's no southern one, there's no territory down here that would be able to come in as a slave state at the same time. So we need another compromise. And of course, this one also failed. So I know I'm going fast, but you can pause, follow along. In 1850, a set of new laws. So this is a bunch of laws that got passed about the same time. Again, trying to calm down that slave debate, trying to use compromise to chill things down. Yes, California is going to become a free state and tip that balance, but it was going to give the South some things, and that was enough to let it pass through Congress. But, yeah, failed. Well, one of those things that was given for the South to help them was a new law that made it a federal crime to help runaway slaves, to help anyone escape from slavery. So you got Northerners. This is a big deal in Boston, the Boston area. There are a number of slaves that get caught, and there's a lot of protest about that around here. Another problem is that it leaves all that in-between territory between Texas and California is open for future debate. Slavery might be able to happen there. So again, it's just moving the discussion later on. And here's another failed compromise, one called popular sovereignty, which is a fancy way of saying whatever's popular, whatever the people want, let them decide. Remember, that was an issue back around the Constitution period too. And the founders did not want they tried to avoid this idea as much as possible. But here we are, struggles in Congress for, well, over 30 years about where slavery can go and where it can't go. So they make a new idea. Hey, let's just let those Americans, anyone in those territories, when they get up to enough people, I believe it's 10,000 people, then they can vote. So again, this is to calm the debate in Congress. Both sides see hope, right? It gives both sides an opening. Hey, it could go either way. Whoever wants this, pro or anti-slavery, yeah, it's America, right? That's part of how this is going to help. We're just following our democratic ideas. Well, it fails. Why would it fail? Well, when you let the people decide on something, sometimes it gets violent, it gets nasty. So the first time this is tried in Kansas, it gets violent very quickly. Both sides are sending men pro-slavery, anti-slavery. They're going to so-called stuff the ballot box. They're going to add votes, even though they don't plan to live there. They're going to get to vote and to scare away opponents. So I'll just quickly show you here a couple of advertisements. Here's one trying to get pro-slavery folks to come to the rescue. And about the same time, same kind of style, Kansas, keep it a free state. And this turns to, well, struggles like this. This is one of many pictures from that kind of time period. Of course, no photography back then. Here's my favorite. Isn't this awesome? Here's a guy who's very excited and upset about all this. Another rather dramatic illustration of Bleeding Kansas, it was called. Kansas was bleeding. All right. Individuals on both sides stirred up trouble, and they did this very much on purpose. One of them, first one I'll show you, John C. Calhoun. Here's a painting of him in the 1830s, I believe this was. Here's him a little bit later in life, getting kind of serious there, 1840 something. Oh my gosh, whoa. Wow. There's a photograph of him, and yeah, those paintings did not do him justice. Look at those eyes. Wow. All right, I'll just keep that over there. He was a senator from South Carolina, and the C does not stand for compromise. He has some interesting things to say about slavery. Actually believed, as far as we know, believed that it was actually good for slaves. just something you could dig into another time. He's important because he's starting to encourage states like South Carolina to secede and think about the rights of states, think of more of like a confederation, like the Articles of Confederation. Um, and that's what ends up happening after his life's over, of course. Preston Brooks, another guy from South Carolina, a senator in the 1850s. Loved John C. Calhoun's ideas. Also supported slavery. Not really a well-known guy until he does this. He almost kills another senator. Charles Sumner of Massachusetts beats him in the head with a cane. And supporters ended up sending him extra canes. There's Sumner. And here's a picture, again, showed in newspapers. Sort of, I believe this is a Massachusetts newspaper, so it's sympathetic to Sumner. Uncle Tom's Cabin. So here's a book that gets written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Tells the violent story of cruelty of slavery, really appealed to emotions of readers. There's a very wrenching scene where the slave mother has to give up her child, get separated from her child, and that really wrecks the emotions of folks in the North. Sold millions of copies, and makes abolitionism not just a political idea, but something relatable, understandable. And here's a guy, John Brown, another guy who wants slavery to be ended. It was a family thing. He killed some folks during that Bleeding Kansas period. And then 3 years later, he gets an idea to raid a weapons warehouse in Virginia and give guns to slaves. This is a northerner who's going to help slaves. It doesn't work out. He gets put on trial. Here's him marching to his execution. But he really confirmed the fears that some Southerners had about slaves, their slaves rising up, and about abolitionists. Here's actually a case of a Northern guy trying to help bring violence down to the South. Remember, this is before the war started. And the last name, a guy you might have heard of before, Abraham Lincoln. Here's a pretty well-known quote from him, sort of shows his stance on what he feels about how long slavery can last in the country. He'd been against slavery, was even against the Mexican War. When he gets elected president in 1860, that's like the last straw, like the straw that breaks the camel's back kind of expression. It could take a lot of weight, and then one last one, just the camel can't take it anymore. And several states, starting with South Carolina, surprise, surprise, John C. Calhoun state, split from the U.S. So why him? Why was that a big deal? He was the only anti-slavery candidate, but he was only talking about limiting slavery in those Western territories. He's not talking about ending it in South Carolina or Texas or any other southern state, but they still don't trust him. So again, this map, you could pause and look at this more closely, but it shows sort of how he wins, where he wins, votes, how many votes he gets. He does not get a majority, but with our electoral system, that's enough. So that's what really puts it over the edge. All right, the very last cause, fear. Raw emotion. It's not a rational feeling, of course. Fear is irrational. It makes people do crazy and terrible things. Being afraid, I believe, is perhaps the number one cause for both sides. You had Northerners fearing the actions of God will strike us down if we don't end slavery. And you had folks in the southern slave states feeling like, well, but God made two races. We have to follow what we believe his design was. So you've got religious fears on both sides. You had Southerners, again, afraid, what do we do without slavery? We've always had it. Ever since there were colonies, they'd had it. You have Northerners watching slavery spread, thinking, what's to stop this from being just Africans, just people with darker skin? Maybe they'll try to enslave white people too. You have Southerners afraid of things like John Brown and things that he'd done. Slaves already want to kill us, and these Northerners are going to help them do it. And then you have Northerners seeing, whoa, wait, Southerners are starting to get ready, prepare militias, just like in colonial times. We need to get ready too. And that brings men and women to this fear right here. I must protect my family. I must protect my country. And when you have that feeling rampant, that's when you're going to find a war. And that's how we get the Civil War that we had. So there's a real brief version, ending with fear. And I did it in less than 15 minutes. Wow.